Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Paul Adamson. I'm chairman of Forum Europe. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all to this Bayer Live Talks session number 2, entitled The Science of Transparency, Delivering Quality of Life Improvements Through Transparent Science and Policy Making. Before I introduce our speakers, let me briefly set the scene. I think we can all agree that a trusted relationship between science, business, and policy making is essential for the proper functioning of our democracies. Science and academia both play a necessary role in policymaking, offering evidence-based research to guide the formulation and direction of the rules that govern us. We are, however, living in a period of increased distrust in traditional institutions, with the organizations and experts that were once valued and relied upon now subject to growing skepticism. In the context of the recent strengthening of transparency rules for those seeking to influence policymaking in Europe, and following the public consultation on developing a fit-for-purpose European innovation ecosystem to boost innovation cohesion, this second session in the Bayer Live Talk series will look at the fault lines and opportunities in the relationship between policymakers, business, and the scientific community. We will debate the role of business in funding academic and scientific research, and what tools are available to ensure transparency and accountability in the process. What guardrails currently exist to ensure that evidence-based policymaking can actually thrive. With the European Union undertaking several initiatives to reinforce the ambition and global competitiveness of its European research area, and while the demand for insight and future-proof policymaking increases, how is the business community working to ensure that it continues to play a positive role in science and research, and what are the implications for the innovation agenda in Europe? To kick things off, it gives me very great pleasure to invite Stephan Schruth, Head of Public Affairs, European Union at Bayer AG, to take over. Over to you, Stephan.
Thanks, Paul, and good afternoon, everyone. Also from my side, thanks for joining us today. As Paul has said, my name is Stephan Schruth. I'm leading Bayer's public affairs work here in Brussels, and I have the pleasure to also welcome you to this second session of the new Bayer Live Talks, a series which we've launched earlier this year in cooperation with Forum Europe. As we only recently have started with this new event series, I would like to just very briefly outline once more the purpose of this format. As a global life science company active in the fields of healthcare and nutrition, we at Bayer firmly believe that scientific research and the development of new approaches is key to tackle some of the fundamental challenges our society is faced with. This is why, with the Bayer Live Talks, we aim at fostering an open dialogue on the role of innovation in modern societies and the contribution it can make to overcoming these challenges that have been outlined by the United Nations in the Sustainable Development Goals. At Bayer, we firmly believe in the power of innovation to fuel sustainable development for growth and for the benefit of people worldwide. We recognize the need to drive sustainable progress. Fighting climate change, biodiversity loss, and global disease will require innovative solutions, and it is our goal to bring them out of the lab and into the world. And I think the development of new vaccines and treatments against COVID-19 in record time is a striking example how scientific research can very concretely help to address pressing needs of society. Still, these solutions need to win people's trust to successfully generate real impact. And yet again, the pandemic has demonstrated that all too clear. To garner trust in new products and processes, people need to be able to understand what companies are doing and how we're doing it. And for that, they need us to be transparent. What goes for businesses is also true for the policymaking process, in which transparency is equally important for the public trust. We therefore welcome the recent agreement between the Commission, the European Parliament, and now also the Council for a common mandatory transparency register that Paul also alluded to. In addition to reporting our political activities in the relevant transparency registers, we publish data on our public affairs resources also in the annual report and make our key political positions transparent on our website. To mention another example, at Bayer, we regularly assess and disclose the alignment of our industry associations regarding their climate positioning, together with our own commitments on halting climate change. Today's discussion will look at how transparent and science-based policymaking can help to address the manifold challenges we are facing. We have an excellent panel. Therefore, without further ado, I very much look forward now to our discussion and to a continuous exchange with you all on further subjects in one of the future Live Talk sessions. Just before handing it back over to Paul, a quick note that there is a virtual exhibition area that you can find on the event platform. We invite you to visit that space after the event for further information that has been provided by several of our panelists there. So thanks again for joining us today. And now Paul will introduce the panel to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Stephan, for those opening remarks. We are now very privileged to have an opening keynote address by Nicole Grobert, who's the chair of the group of chief scientific advisors to the European Commission. I think making quite a rare public appearance, I think, Nicole. So thank you very much for being with us today, and over to you.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Paul. So yeah, I'm the chair of the group of chief scientific advisors to the European Commission, but in my daytime job, I'm a professor of nanomaterials at the Department of Materials at the University of Oxford. I'd like to thank you very much for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to give a keynote speech at this exciting event, BioLife Talks. I think it's a very important initiative in order to foster the engagement and exchange of thoughts amongst the different entities and stakeholders, including scientists, the Commission and industry. The organizers asked me to address the value of independent evidence-based scientific advice for policymaking, and also the importance of transparency to strengthen this process. And a very important aspect of this is to rebuild or build trust, as Stephan just alluded to strengthen, rebuild the trust between policymakers, business, society, and science. So trust is really the first I'd like to kick off with, as it is so essential. It's the basis for society to function, and trust is the basis of relationships, everyday relationships. A child unconditionally trusts its mother, and when we feel unwell, we seek medical advice or help from a doctor who we trust. Research on the whole is based on trust. Scientists trust the data that we have obtained and data that's presented by our colleagues. Yet trust beyond that of a child and a mother is mainly built upon experience and the critical and often evidence-based exchange between two parties. So we need to have some sort of a sign or some evidence to be able to build trust. Evidence such as helping someone can strengthen trust, for example, that would be such a sign, but also time, knowing somebody for a long period helps to strengthen trust. Trust is absolutely crucial when it comes to science advice to policy. Trust is important everywhere. Scientific advisors need to be able to trust the scientific data and the evidence that is provided in a given field. And policymakers, for this scientific advice to work, policymakers need to trust the scientists who advise them based on the scientific evidence. And in turn, society must trust the policymakers for a country to function well. And I'm sure you can think of many more examples in your daily lives. However, specifically to the science advice, there's a risk that this trust is undermined by unrealistic expectations. For example, if citizens and policymakers expect science to speak always with one voice and provide all the certain answers that policymakers or society is looking for. So if politicians appeal to following the science to just evade their own responsibilities, that relationship, I think, is quite critical, that they don't abuse science as the people who know. As scientists, we know that scientific knowledge is tentative, and we have to acknowledge its limitations. We have to be transparent about it. We also have to acknowledge that the independence of politics is important. So they live in their own ecosystem in a way, and therefore we must build mutually trusted and respectful relationships with politicians. So they respect the science, we respect the politicians. And building trust takes time in everyday life and when it comes to science advice in particular. Now, I'm sure nobody really wants to bring up the P word, the pandemic, but I'm afraid it does play a crucial role here also in science advice. In many ways, COVID hit society as a whole like a lightning strike, or possibly worse, because lightning strikes are not as long ongoing as this pandemic currently is. And the pandemic itself has put science advice under pressure, under significant pressure. It had, on the one hand, great visibility during the pandemic, especially in the initial and very acute phase. But there was also, or there is still, a very high risk of individual high-profile experts being called upon to advise on absolutely everything as the voice of science as a whole. And that doesn't work. Instead, we need adequate mechanisms with a broad range of expertise, which need to be put in place, and they need to be visible. And policymakers need to have the right incentives to consult them, not to, basically to save themselves. Moreover, it is important to take values into account in the broadest sense when providing scientific advice, because different cultural backgrounds have different values and different needs, and these we must not neglect. Achieving scientific integrity and ethically sound evidence for scientific advice is the basis for building trust. So what are the mechanisms? And Stephan earlier mentioned there are different mechanisms that are established. There are many different mechanisms that exist to transfer know-how between science and politics. They are chief scientific advisors, advisory councils, Academy of Sciences, scientific agencies, etc., etc. They each operate in a slightly different manner. They all have their strengths and weaknesses. In the EU, we have, amongst others, the scientific advice mechanism, which brings together some of these elements that I just mentioned. And this science advice mechanism, for short SAM, is complementing, for example, efforts that is currently being conducted by the Commission Science Knowledge Center, JRC, and you have their own David Mayer also later on the panel discussion. So SAM, more specifically, who are we and what do we do? So SAM consists of 3 entities. It's the Group of Chief Scientific Advisors. It's also SAPEA, which is a consortium consisting of 100 or more European academies, which provides reviews, evidence reviews by experts, policy options. And then there's the Group of Chief Scientific Advisors who collaborates with SAPEA and also the Commission. The Group of Chief Scientific Advisors provides then the recommendations to EU policymakers based on the evidence that has been gathered by SAPEA. And the way we work to foster trust, we aim to follow key principles of scientific integrity and transparency. And the first, sort of the 6 key points I'd like to mention now is we're selected by an independent scientific identification committee, and we're typically appointed for a maximum of 5 years. So there is a constant turnover. Yet we have enough time to develop a deeper understanding on how the mechanism works, and we can contribute to that mechanism. We have to declare our interests, any conflicts, to make sure that there isn't any conflict. And very importantly, we act in our personal capacity and are bound to be impartial. We're independent of any political or institutional interests, and the group selects its own chair, the agenda, and adopts their own rules of procedures. So this is the science advice mechanism in short, which brings me to another key word that is as important as trust, and that is to communicate the uncertainty. As a scientist and as a member of the Group of Chief Science Advisors and chair of that group, it is particularly important to build trust. I mentioned that earlier. And communicating findings and scientific evidence in a clear and accessible manner is one of the most important tools for building this trust. What does that mean in practice? So when we provide advice that is based on scientific evidence, we need to very clearly state of what we know. We need to also say what we do not know. We need to paint a clear picture on what is uncertain and what is simply unknowable. To communicate risks and uncertainty without undermining trust in science advice is difficult, but it can be done. And we must be transparent and open in explaining how we analyze, for example, our scientific evidence and how we develop the policy options and recommendations. So this process is actually very clear, and it's also accessible for anybody who would like to know more about it. So any reasons for divergent scientific views should be also clarified and explained where possible. So if you bring many experts together, you're bound to have different opinions and views, and also different streams of experts. So expert panels and evidence reports should aim at consensus. That's the ultimate goal, but not at the expense of the rigor of the deliberation, because dissenting views should be also documented and explained, as these could also help understand the situation better. So legitimate scientific dissent can be useful to policy. For example, it can offer sort of early warnings and on any sort of important problem or any minority scientific views. But let me conclude here, and I'm looking forward to the panel discussion later. So in the times of crisis, trust is even more important. I think nobody's denying that. And it's even more important to collaborate. And with the BioLife talks, I think this is an excellent example where different entities are convening and collaborating, discussing. We need to connect with others. It's this what BioLife talks are doing. And to communicate well, and this applies to all areas of life, including science advice. In Europe, we have a great diversity of mechanisms due to different political cultures and institutional histories. And in short, there's not just one size fits all. That is not the case. And therefore, it's even more important that we need a mutual understanding and better connection and collaboration. We need a science advice ecosystem in Europe that is better connected. It brings together advisors from across thematic areas and from different countries. Building such ecosystem and trust again takes time, and therefore, continuing effort in this direction are vital for a better Europe and the world as a whole. And with David Mayer on the panel, you have a great defender of building this ecosystem, and I'm looking forward to that discussion later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Nicole. Before I move on to the panel, I'd like to, if I may, ask you a couple of questions based on what you've just been telling us. You talked a lot about managing unrealistic expectations. The public expects scientists to speak with one voice. From your perspective, where does the responsibility lie in trying to educate the public about what is reasonable to expect and what is not reasonable to expect? Should scientists spend more time, precious time, being more pedagogic, not just on their findings, but what science is all about? As you say, there may be more than one way of looking at a problem. There are things you have to be more frank about what you do not know. Or do you think in some way the public should take more of its own time to understand what scientists do and what they cannot do?
I think it's the answer is probably both, but I'd like to go beyond that. And I think we need to start much earlier, in the sense that society as a whole needs to consider the role of science in building a society and teaching young kids the importance of uncertainty. And I think it comes very, very late when we talk about transparency and uncertainty, very late in our lives, even in my own life. University studies, you have some sort of concept about it, but it really just hit when I started to be a member of the group of chief scientific advisors, when I realized how important communicating the uncertainty really is. So I think we have to collectively address this issue. We have to find solutions that it is brought up at schools and universities early on.
One final question, Nicole, if I may. You were quite diplomatic, but you were talking also about the relationship between scientists on the one hand and politicians on the other, and how quite often politicians are guilty of using the kind of mantra, follow the science, when it's a kind of detraction from their own political obligations. But you did go on to say also that we have to develop mutually respectful relations between scientists and politicians. As things stand at the moment, what is your view on this relationship between scientists and politicians at the moment? Are there concerning signs of abuse, quote unquote, or should we not get too exercised about it at this stage?
Well, my personal impression is that both parties are very keen to make that relationship work very well, and that it's not intentionally done in the sense that what the scientists said. So we just need a little bit more time to make it work in the sense that it's at its optimum, what I think. But overall, I think it's going all in the right directions, because policymakers are clearly open to science, probably more than ever. And it's now the time to really address that working relationship in a very constructive manner. And again, BioLife Talks is one of the elements that can contribute to make this better.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Nicole. I think you can stay for a short while for the panel. And if you want to come back into the discussion before you finally leave us, do make that yourself heard, and we'll bring you back into the discussion later on. Thank you very much again, Nicole.
Thank you.
I'm now going to move on to our panel. And let me introduce briefly each member of that panel. Firstly, David Mayer, who's head of unit Knowledge for Policy, Concepts and Methods at the Joint Research Centre at the European Commission. Welcome, David. Michael Vorländer, who's head of unit for Education and Research at the German Permanent Representation to the European Union. Welcome, and Michael. Dr. Anna Meyer-Mertens, executive director of Transparency International Germany. Welcome to you, Anna Meyer. And Lydia Borrell-Damier, Secretary General of Science Europe. Welcome to you, Lydia. And finally, Dr. Monica Lessi, who is the Senior Vice President, Head of Corporate R&D and Social Innovation at Bayer AG. And welcome to you, Monica. Quite a big panel. Maybe can we first start with David and maybe give your a few opening remarks, and maybe spend a few precious seconds of the time allotted to you explaining a bit what your role is, because it may not be totally familiar to everybody watching this discussion. David, over to you.
Thank you very much, Paul, for this opportunity. Yes, the Joint Research Centre is the science and knowledge service of the European Commission. So we're not an agency, we're inside the Commission. We're another DG, but we have a special mission. Our role is to bring scientific evidence into the EU policy process. And we do that for pretty much every single European policy. Obviously, we don't do all the science for all the policies, but we cover a huge range of natural and social science disciplines. And we work with pretty much every policy DG. And we have one foot, therefore, in the scientific community, doing scientific projects. We have laboratories, but another foot, we are sitting around the table, giving comments on policy proposals before they're adopted. And of course, we have a commissioner, Commissioner Gabriel, and a director general in the normal way. And obviously, we believe that policy is much better if it is informed by scientific evidence. That is our whole vocation. But we have discovered that this is not easy, and simply adding more science or communicating it better or reducing the uncertainty is not going to change how people feel about vaccines, if they're against vaccines or wearing masks or climate change or whatever. Simply adding more science doesn't change the policy problem. So we have undertaken some research to understand what is going on there. And I think I can try and summarize this research, and I've asked the two reports I'm talking about to be put in the chat, and one of them you can see on the infographic behind me. But I think the provocative message I want to get across is you may be laboring under the misconception that if we can just get clear on the science and agree on the science, then the policy will follow as night follows day. And that sort of causality appears to be inherent in how we work. First, let's agree on the science, and then we'll agree on the policy. Unfortunately, that does not work. That is profoundly wrong. Until we abandon that model, I think we're going to be struggling with the problems that we see today. Firstly, it is formally wrong because the science itself does not contain the answer as what you should do about it. It's the classic is-ought distinction. Because the world is a certain way, that does not contain in itself the way the world should be. There is a wealth of policy options we might want to take, and the work on values and identities you can see behind me shows that we have a diversity of values as human beings, and therefore sometimes there may be what appears to be someone is misinformed or doesn't seem to understand the science, but there may simply be a genuine difference about what they want the policy to be. And we have lost sight of that in our debate. And the other reason why this is the right way round is because, unfortunately, our paradoxical human nature means that it's not like we get clear with the science in our head and then we work out what we want to do. Instead, this thing called my side bias, to which we are all prone, means that when we are confronted with science that challenges our sacred values, our core values, or our key identities, all of us, no matter how intelligent, no matter which side of the political spectrum, get busy attacking the science. That's hardwired into our nature that we think this way. So until we understand these two facts, that basically policymaking and politics is not like science. And if we try and treat it like science, we're not, frankly, going to make much progress. Thank you.
Thank you. So you put a lot into those 3 or 4 minutes, David. I got a lot of questions for you, but I'll hold back for a moment in order to make sure that the rest of the panel have time to make their own interventions. I'll now turn to Michael. Maybe Michael could also tell us how do you react to what has been said so far, but also, given you're from such a large and important member state of the European Union, maybe explain briefly how you go about that at the national level and how you think it works well with efforts made by people like David and his colleagues at the EU level.
Yeah, many thanks. And first of all, I would like to thank Bayer and Forum Europe for having organized today's virtual event on this very important topic of science and evidence-based policy making and transparency. Just a couple of general thoughts, which I would like to share with all of you from the perspective of a representative of a member state, in that case, Germany. So there can be no doubt, of course, that with the increasing complexity of a multitude of challenges and developments, policymaking is more than ever dependent on scientific advice to make evidence-based decisions and set a course. Science and evidence-based policymaking is crucial for building trust in societies and must, of course, be accompanied by dedicated communication and outreach. And trust is the most important currency for arriving at viable, socially accepted solutions, especially on controversial issues. And this was also emphasized by previous speakers. Currently, the unfortunately ongoing corona pandemic has shown how important scientific knowledge and expertise are for political decisions. Around the world, the virus has triggered a crisis affecting all areas of society and the economy, to which adequate responses were and are needed. A functioning dialogue between science, business, politics, and the public has proven to be very valuable also in Germany and, of course, in the European Union. In this context, the German National Academy of Sciences, the Leopoldina, among others, has played an important role in Germany, developing various recommendations, some of them at very short notice. And these recommendations, of course, were submitted to the Federal Chancellery of the German government. In addition, the German Ethics Council should be mentioned as an example from a German perspective as well, whose duties include informing the public and encouraging discussion in society, preparing opinions and recommendations for political and legislative action for the German federal government and the German parliament. At the European level, of course, the scientific advice mechanism plays a prominent role, as already presented in detail before by Nicole. Let me also highlight that the topics of science advice, evidence-informed policymaking in the European research area, the examination of the possible establishment of an EU science media network to ensure more factual journalistic reporting on science, as well as the strengthening of the exchange between science and citizens, are also prominently addressed in important European research area documents just recently adopted at the meeting of the EU Council of Research Ministers on 26th of November, so just 2 weeks ago. The so-called Pact for Research Innovation in Europe on the one hand, and the Council conclusions on the new governance of the European research area, including a policy agenda with concrete actions. At national level in Germany, the coalition treaty of our brand new government underlines the importance of science communication and participation as well. And as you know, just today, the new chancellor has been sworn in Germany. And the coalition treaty was signed yesterday. So everything is fresh and new in this regard. And let me quote the new coalition treaty. Science is not a closed system, but thrives on exchange and communication with society. We want to systematically anchor science communication at all scientific career levels and in the approval of funding. We advocate for the promotion of science journalism through an independent foundation. End of quote. So, ladies and gentlemen, in summary, for sustainable, socially accepted political decisions on complex challenges, we need above all knowledge, evidence, trust, transparency, cooperation, and dialogue with all stakeholders and at all levels. And in this context, of course, the BioLife talks really play an important role in fostering such a dialogue with all actors. So many thanks again for that. And I look forward to our further discussion. Back to you, dear Paul. Thanks.
Thank you very much, dear Michael. Again, many questions, but I'll hold back until we've heard from everybody on the panel. I now turn to Anna-Maya. Maybe Anna-Maya, from your perspective, give us an idea of how concerned you are about the level of transparency between scientists on one hand, between policymakers and politicians on the other, and of course behind the corporate sector, who often is instrumental in funding a lot of this scientific research. Over to you, Anna-Maya.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you also for the invitation and the opportunity to join this discussion. I very much enjoyed the keynote of Nicole Krobat. She mentioned 3 key elements I would just like to comment. First of all, of course, for TI, Transparency International, it's very sort of crucial to disclose certain conflicts of interest. So she mentioned that it's also for the scientists, because scientists are also human beings with different interests. So it could be also that they have some sort of conflicts of interest. It's important to disclose these conflicts in order to be able to cope with that. The second was also how to generate trust is also sort of context driven. I'm originally from Finland, and I know there's a huge difference between the culture of transparency in Finland and in Germany, where I now live for already very long time. And I love this country, but this is a very big difference between these two. And maybe the third part is the uncertainty, how to get along with uncertainty. And we can sort of not to make it disappear, but we have to get along with that. And that's a very crucial thing also for anti-corruption. There are so many risks that you cannot just say before what to do in this situation. There are 3 points basically I would like to make. The first is what you already mentioned, also David mentioned, that is sort of you should not ask only one scientist or only one corner of the society. And I think it's one example, if you are a politician thinking whether or not you should close the schools, it depends, the answer you get depends on who you ask. If you are asking an health expert dealing with pandemic diseases, she or he will probably say you should close the schools. But if you ask an expert dealing with mental health, she or he would probably say you should not close the schools because this is a key for mental health of kids, just this social interaction. So what we need is a broad involvement, broad engagement. And this is also, by the way, it counts not only for this interaction between science and political decision making, but also in the context of lobbying. As Transparency International, we are also lobbyists, lobbying for better anti-corruption framework. But it's also, and it is very important, that's not only evidence-based, the political decision-making, but also need-driven. So it should be sort of an interest of citizens, the political decision-making, what occurs. So it's important to open it up to be very broad. The second is, of course, and we know that as lobbyists as well, when we enter the decision political decision making, we enter the sphere of power. And of course, you have there, when you are in the sphere of power, there is always this risk of undue influence. So how to cope with that? We need to have more transparency just to avoid these certain risks. And this is why we should declare and have this lobbying regulation. And I very much, what Michael already mentioned, we have this new coalition agreement, and there are good improvements, in my opinion. Still, there are only plans, but I think it's great. And this third one, you shouldn't increase transparency just in order to improve anti-corruption, but also to enhance innovations. Because when we talk about the competitiveness of the European research area, European Union, I used to be a consultant in Bonn and consulting also the Federal Ministry of Research and Education in Germany, advising how to be more innovative. And I do believe that also in the European Union, we need more open innovation. And it means that we should disclose some sort of these connections between science, business, and science and politics. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna-Maja. Again, many questions, but I'll hold back. I now turn to you, Lydia. Over to you. And maybe also a few words at the beginning about what Science Europe does and what it maybe does not do, which is very much one of the themes of this afternoon's panel discussion. Over to you, Lydia.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Paul. And also thank you very much to the organizers of the event for their kind invitation. Yes, well, I represent an organization that is called Science Europe. It is composed of national research funding and performing organizations from 28 countries in Europe, not in EU. As we have people from organizations from Switzerland, from United Kingdom, Iceland, and Norway. Our mission is to promote research and to contribute to define the best research policies in the context of the European research area and also worldwide. We are members of an organization that is called the Global Research Council, where we define common policies worldwide, and we addressed important issues, including, of course, trust in science. So this dialogue is absolutely relevant to our priorities. We in Science Europe, very recently, that was 10 days ago, we issued a statement on research culture. That's becoming one of our main priorities to, how can I say, reassess the values underpinning the conception and conduct and dissemination of research. We believe this is very timely because of this unfortunately growing mistrust in science. And we believe that by reassessing the values of underpinning the research activity, we can regain the trust in science, or at least place science in the position in society that it deserves. Many of you have made an emphasis on how important it is to get solid evidence knowledge to define the right policy positions. And for that, we need to provide the citizens the certainty that the best available knowledge today is put at the service of the policy making. Therefore, we believe that issues of ethics and integrity are of paramount importance, and still we find cases of misconduct. We need to address that urgently in the research sector, because we need every single researcher to understand that an integral conduct in performing research is an enabler of good science, is the best possible characteristic of a researcher, next to the intellect, of course. But we believe that this is important, and it is fundamental to any policy developed for research. Having said that, we believe that researchers need to be recognized for a broader set of activities beyond publications, beyond the development of methodologies, beyond what is purely related to the scientific work. And be more recognized for activities such as input in education, input in communication, etc. And when we come to communication, which is of paramount importance, doesn't mean that every researcher has to become a scientist, a journalist. There are some people who naturally are better for communicating science. There are others who may not be at their best. But what it is important is the environment surrounding a scientist. What supporting mechanisms a scientist or a team of scientists receive to communicate in the right way. We believe that this is very important, and that the research funding organizations and the research performing organizations must take care that there are proper channels of communicating science to make that path more effective. Of course, then policymakers will take the necessary decisions to the best of their knowledge. But as Nicola and other speakers said today, the mission of science is to provide the best knowledge and be honest about what we know and what we don't know. And that has to be very transparent. I could leave it here for the moment.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Lydia. Fascinating stuff. Last but not least, as I always said on these occasions, I turn to you, Monica. And maybe you could explain also from Bayer's point of view, or maybe broadly from the industry's point of view, the interaction between a company like Bayer and the outside scientific community, how these relationships are created, how they're sustained, and what kind of rules are in place to make sure that the transparency and the ethical oversight is always uppermost in both communities.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if we look on what are the big challenges today, and I mean, we have talked about climate change or aging populations, or like, I think we all agree we need science and innovation to find the new solutions in order to find them. But we also need public trust so that we can land the innovation at those places where they are needed. And this is, I think, very crucial to build this trust. And one key element which is important is openness from my perspective. And it's about openness on the process, how science is working. And I think that Nicole mentioned that earlier, yeah? So that science may not have all the answers, but be transparent. What is the process of science? So that is one point. The second is how decisions are being made of politicians. So what aspects have been influencing their decisions? And this can be scientific, evidence-based aspects. But of course, a politician has to take into account many more aspects to come to a decision. But to be transparent, how this decision has been taken is another very important aspect. And the third element of openness is also on how is innovation happening also in terms of a corporate company. And here, of course, partnerships with academic institutions and so on play a very important role. But if you also look on respective polls, where does mistrust occur? People are kind of suspicious, where does funding come from, maybe for some of the research activities. And so again, I think the aspect of openness here is crucial. And that's why we, for example, decided to becoming transparent on our collaborations with public institutions, academic institutions. So in which area are working together? What's the overall volume of the partnership? Because I think the moment you open this up, you demystify sometimes the whole process. And I think this is where we are coming about. We have nothing to hide. So why don't be open and transparent about it? So yeah, I think this overall aspect on openness, how decisions are being made, how the process of innovation, how the process of research is being done is for me very important. And I think for us overall as an industry.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Monica. Well, we've heard from all panelists now. I have so many questions to ask all of you. And I just remind the audience, by the way, if you want to also post a question to the panel through the chat function, please do so, and I'll do my level best to make sure your question is taken. In the meantime, let me start somewhere. This theme of uncertainty and about how, and Nicole's earlier point about managing expectations, it seems to me that scientists and politicians from different perspectives are under enormous pressure to give certainty and not to be allowed the reality of what is real in this current situation, in particular at the moment of uncertainty. I think President Harry Truman once said famously, "Please give me a one-armed or one-handed economist, because I'm sick of being told on the one hand and on the other hand." I just wonder whether scientists should also be allowed that freedom. And at some point, if the public were better educated, that there's, as one of you said, there's no single scientific voice. I think, again, go back to Nicole, and there's different ways, David was saying as well. We have to agree that there are different ways of approaching topics, and I just wonder whether that is part of the solution, is trying to sensitize public opinion that there is no single voice on science, that there is uncertainty, there is the unknowable, to use again one of Nicole's phrases. Anybody want to react to that? David, go ahead. We'll unmute you if they want.
Thanks. I'm sort of worried that's a red herring and a dead end, and I would avoid us trying to think that science can somehow raise its game and solve the underlying problems in our politics and society. I think that will be an enormous mistake if we put the burden of solving this problem on scientists. If only scientists could somehow be a bit more certain and a bit more clear and visualize their stuff a bit better, all these problems are going away. From the work we have done in this area, that is not the answer to these problems. And let's be clear, we're not talking about here whether people trust in science per se. We're not saying, do they trust that the periodic table is an accurate representation of the elements? That's one question. We're asking whether citizens trust science for the purposes of policy. And I fear that the extent to which they will trust science for the purposes of policy is very closely correlated with the extent to which they trust government and politicians. So if, rather than saying, how can we improve the science so people trust the science for the policy, I think the answer is, how can we improve the trust in government and in politicians, and then the trust in the science for the policy will follow from that. It's that way round. The reality of our psychology is that we see science which touches on things we care about through the prism of our values and identities, even the most intelligent of us, and we can't unwish that fact. Science itself is a unique community where scientists as individuals overcome those obstacles, because to seek truth is a cardinal value in science. In all other identities and tribes, sometimes it's worth sacrificing truth and accuracy because there are more valuable things at stake. So I would really hesitate to lay all the challenge of solving this problem about why people don't appear to accept the science on the science themselves. That itself is a misreading of the underlying science of how we trust and how we know.
Yeah, I think to be fair, I wasn't being terribly clear then, David. It was more about how, in a sense, scientists are unfairly treated because they're expected to provide at any given moment 100% certainty, when in effect, uncertainty is much more likely to be the order of the day. But we'll move on because I need to bring in Anna Maya and then Monica. Anybody else on the panel, just raise your hand and I'll pick you up. Anna Maya.
No, thank you. I would agree with what David said, and also see the responsibility of the political side, and also ask, I do believe, although I'm from TI, Transparency International, I would say transparency cannot be the only solution. It could help. But what do we mean by transparency? So it's not just transparency to disclose certain things, but you need to explain and communicate. And I think this is something we really didn't do well enough, at least here at the national level in Germany. So to explain what are the different roles, what is the path, what is the connection here, and what we see at the moment in Germany, there is a huge anger. You see that in the social media, but everywhere, against some scientists. Although they are just doing their research, they are not responsible for the political decision making. Mm-hmm. And this is why I do believe that the political side should explain what is happening at the moment here, and also disclosing all the connections and telling who are they asking, and not only one part.
Thank you. Monica, I think you want to comment, and then Michael. Monica.
Yeah, I think in part I agree with you, David, that of course the trust in the government is critical also, and then maybe trust in science follows, because as we see also on the vaccination, there are countries which have a low vaccination rate because they have such a low trust in their government and not necessarily in the science behind it. So I think it's an absolutely valid point. But on the other hand, I'm from Germany, so Germany is a very risk-averse country. So then it could be the other way around, that politicians go for a safe position, not following, let's say, the new science or kind of new technologies, because I kind of want to secure the votes of certain groups. So I think it can also go the other way around. Therefore, I think it is very important that people form their own opinion also about science. And maybe let me bring in one aspect. This is about that they experience science. Yeah, again, it's about the openness. And I mean, there are approaches about becoming a scientist, citizen scientists. So this is one way, and becoming part of a scientific process. So you better understand the complexity, and that it's not just maybe one answer. And again, the openness on how decisions are being made in the political process. Yeah. So what has been taken into account. So that would be, from my perspective, important. Yeah.
Thank you, Monica. Michael?
Yeah, I can very much echo what has been said by Anna Maya, and of course also Monica and David. I mean, definitely we need to be honest about the different opinions that of course also exist in science, and about uncertainties. I mean, no doubt about that. I mean, honesty is necessary here. At the same time, I believe that in this context, for instance, academies of sciences play a very important role, because they are bundling the many different opinions in the scientific disciplines. And in this context, also the scientific advice mechanism at the EU level is another good example to really pool the expertise which is there across Europe, in order to come up with sound recommendations which are supported by many scientists across disciplines. So again, this working together of the different levels at the member state level, but also, of course, at the EU level, I think that helps bringing together the scientific expertise to come up with sound recommendations. We have a similar example, for instance, in the field of climate change policy. I mean, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, I think is a very good example how it's possible to actually pool and to bring together the expertise in this field at a global level, and really providing sound recommendations and scientific advice for the decision makers. At the end of the day, and this is of course also true, I mean, governments and the political level, I mean, they are responsible for the decisions that are taken on the basis of such advice. I mean, and that has to be made clear. So I mean, it's really the political level that of course needs to take responsibility for the decisions that are taken. Many thanks, Paul.
Thank you, Michael. Lydia.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, thank you for this very interesting debate. I would like to add that while I see that there are overlapping issues between the mistrust in science and the mistrust in politicians, not everything in science is politicized. Science, very good, is about science, finding evidence, demonstrating hypotheses, verifying hypotheses. I think that there is an element of trust in science on its own right, without entering into political discussions or even policy discussions. And I think there is a place for science in a neutral or apolitical context, whereby science can help and should help, in my view, to a greater extent, to facilitate debates when we debate what is debatable because there is not enough knowledge, but not because we debate some things that are sound knowledge because of years and years of research. I find that in climate, in health discussion, just to put very recent examples, there are beliefs that have been known for years that they are false. This is a useless dialogue. And I think that here the science has a place to come forward and clearly demonstrate the best possible way for citizens to understand something that may be very complex to understand in science, but to try and find ways to put light on debates that shouldn't be a debate, and yet derive our efforts towards places where we could have a constructive debate on some things that we don't yet know, and then ask science to find out those areas where we need more knowledge. So I think there is a place for trust in science on its own right.
Yeah. Well, let's move on. I mean, I want to bring in the rest of the panel, but actually, starting point, a quote from you, Lydia, where you said in one of your remarks initially, was there's a growing mistrust in science, you said, and I'll ask the rest of the panel whether they agree, and I'll ask you, Lydia, why you say that. But as a non-specialist outsider myself, we're kind of used cynically to be distrustful of politicians. We're kind of used cynically to be distrustful of industry, frankly. We're not so used cynically to be distrustful of scientists. So how serious is the situation, and how retrievable is it? Who would like to try and address that? And I'll come back to you, Lydia, at the end, because you're the source of my question. David.
I mean, I work for an organization that profoundly believes we have to solve this problem, because it is clear that the challenges we face cannot be solved without a massive use of science. You know, it's the best thing we've got to tackle these awful problems we face. But it's not enough. It's not enough to bring about the necessary political will to solve these problems. And I think we need to make a distinction between do we want people to trust the science, or do we want people to trust the policy recommendations that are put forward as a basis of that? And sometimes this debate gets into a sort of sterile obscurity around that. I don't think it will be particularly good if every single climate denier is converted and says, yes, I now really understand that climate change is man-made, if none of them then change either their personal behavior or the way they vote to bring about change. What would we have achieved then? That may give us a warm glow that people accept this. But I think here we're talking about trust in science, and this whole conversation is about the role it then plays in personal behavior change or policy change. And once we're in the realm of policy change, then we're not in the world of science anymore. We're in the business of how people know things and how they trust. And the reason we're in such difficulties is because we have a polarized political culture that has lost touch with the ability to tune into people's values, because it is their values and their identities that is driving their attitudes towards the trust in the science. It's no surprise that the highest correlation to non-vaccination in the US is partisan identity. That is, and you may think, well, what is going on there? What has politics got to do whether you approve the vaccine? That doesn't change the science. That's how human beings work. Identity is incredibly important to us. We're tribal. And so that will dictate how we deal with these things. So yes, of course, scientists must work to be trusted, and we've heard all the good things. They must, they must be transparent and open about their values and interests, and they must be excellent and competent. And yes, they must be upfront about their own choices, because science is not value free. The subjects you choose to research, the questions you choose to answer, the data you choose to publish, in what order and which form, that's a purely subjective value judgment. So be upfront in your values choices. And the report on values itself that I've cited, at the beginning, we set out the values that we as the JRC pursued in doing this research, because our research is not values neutral as well, because we've chosen to choose one topic and not another.
Yeah. Thank you, David. Very good point. Anna-Maya, I think you want to come in. Unmute. Oh, somebody unmute you.
Now we are both doing that. I wouldn't agree. I think that there is a general mistrust against the science, because I do believe, at least in Germany, there is a sort of a distrust that there's a behind the science. Who pays the science? That's the basic thing that we ask at TI always, that there is sort of interest-driven science, that this is sort of the scope of science is already set before. But this is the only thing what I believe really drives for this. And of course, there are people, and I think, David, this is what you mentioned also, that we just do not reach with all the evidence that we have. But this has nothing to do, from my point of view, with trusting in science. And if we look at all the indices that we have published during the last 5 years in Germany, at least, there is a distrust in sort of the companies being too powerful behind the political decision making, behind the science. So I think that's why it is the right step for Bayer just to disclose these connections and the collaboration. And of course, it's our part to say it's not enough. It's never not enough, because what we need, of course, it's global standards or level playing field, you would say, at a company. But it shows that it's possible. So always to tell that it's not possible because it's our sort of business securities, it is possible. And that's why I would wish from the European Union to have some sort of level playing field to say what shall be disclosed in terms of the connection.
Thank you. And before I bring back in Lydia, do Michael or Monica want to say anything? Yes, no? Yeah, Michael.
Just very briefly, my impression is really in Germany that really the large majority has trust in science and in research innovation, and I think this was clearly shown now in the context of the coronavirus pandemic. I mean, if I look at podcasts and other social media tools, I mean, which are used by prominent scientists, for instance, like Professor Drosten, so many people are listening and watching such information channels. And I really have the feeling that people understand in Germany, I mean, the huge benefits research and innovation bring to them. I mean, again, the vaccinations are a prime example. I mean, we have BioNTech, Pfizer, for instance, and many other good examples. So again, I really see a large majority having trust in science, in research, innovation. I think we need to build on that. I mean, of course, there's always a number of people having mistrust, and it's hard to reach out to them. I mean, we have to try. We have to keep on trying to persuade them and to convince them of the benefits of research and innovation. But nevertheless, overall, I see really a broad support for research, science, and innovation, and a high degree of trust. So that's my impression.
Okay, Michael. Well, Monica, do you want to come in briefly? Or no?
Yeah, I think I can echo this, that overall, that's also what the polls are saying, that there is quite trust in science. But nevertheless, I think what David mentioned is a challenge, and which are the different value systems. And also what we need to take into account is that, if I remember, the anti-vaccine campaigners not only related to COVID, but they existed before, and they were also building on science. Yeah. So as you may remember, there have been in a renowned journal an article being published on a relationship between vaccination and autism. And so I think it's also about which are the scientific sources that can be trusted. And I think that's also part of an education, or making clear because you can easily create another science, that shows the opposite, And how can people who are not in the system distinguish which is the good science and which is kind of the science you shouldn't rely on? And I'm also talking about predatory journals and so on. So you can very easily find a scientific proof for more or less whatever you want. So, and that's also a problem. So again, I think the scientific system maybe also needs to be there more clear on the standards and making clear which are the reliable sources that you can work with.
Thank you, Monica. So I'll turn to you now, Lydia, and we have to bring this panel discussion to a close very shortly, unfortunately. So you'll see your fellow panelists, Lydia, don't quite share your view, your pessimism, but assuming you're standing by your own words, let me put you slightly on the spot. So what organizations, if the situation is, as you say, this mistrust is there and growing, what organizations like your Science Europe are doing to address that?
Well, yes, indeed. I'm not pessimistic, but as I said before, I speak on behalf of many organizations in Europe, and I don't doubt that there are parts of the population that do trust science. So don't get me wrong. This is a multidimensional problem, and it needs perhaps a more in-depth discussion or in detail discussion that what we can achieve here today. But what I mean is goes more into the there is a proportion of the population that you don't need to convince of the trust in science because they are highly educated, they know it very well, they support it. I'm not talking about that type of population, but I am really talking about the very general public, where under the mistrust of science there are several phenomena below the surface, below the resulting mistrust. It is either a lack of understanding of the scientific process and people able to cope with the uncertainty that some research results may bring. Even if we believe they are knowledge and we believe they are progress, others may interpret them as just another source of knowledge that doesn't bring any certainty. There's a lack of understanding of the research process, is a lack of understanding of science in itself, or is a difficulty in communicating science in a better way along the lines that Monica just said. So it is a complex problem. I don't think I'm not particularly pessimistic, but I don't think the world is rose either. So I do believe that there are places where in society, not country, I'm not speaking about specific countries, we need to address, we need to train people or educate. I know these words don't sound very well to those to the general public, but yes, we need to make them more aware of what research is and how the research contributes.
Okay, thank you so much, Lydia. It's very frustrating, but also maybe a good sign that we have so much still to talk about, but I do have to bring this panel discussion to a close because our next speaker hopefully is waiting to come in and join us. So just for me to say to David, to Michael, to Anna Maya, Lydia and Monica, thank you so much, all of you, for being with us, and hopefully we can carry on the conversation. We surely have not exhausted the topics for conversation in the past few minutes, that's for sure. Thank you again, and I'm not sure you'll stay on the screen. Hopefully you'll stay to listen to our next speaker, and I'm delighted to be joined by Maria de Graça Carvalho, member of the European Parliament, of the European People's Party from Portugal, obviously, a member of the Industry, Research and Energy Committee. Welcome, Maria, to you, and thank you so much for being with us. I'm not sure how much of the discussion so far you've been able to listen to, but we've been talking about many issues, about the role, the fact there is uncertainty in science, there's no single voice in science. Politicians can follow the science up to a point, then they have to take over political responsibility, the whole area of transparency and ethics, and then transparency also as a spur to enhance innovation. Many, many topics we managed to cover in the past 45 minutes or so, but you have this now opportunity, Maria, to finish off our discussion today, and we very much look forward to hearing from you in these concluding remarks. Over to you, Maria.
Good afternoon, and first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. I was able to follow more about 40 minutes of your debate, so I suppose I followed most of it. And it's a subject that I like, and I have worked a lot in the past, especially in the European Commission when I was principal advisor of President Barroso, and I had a role in his decision to have a principal advisor at the time, Professor Anne Glover, and also in the design of the science advice mechanism that with Commissioner Wenders, that was I was in his cabinet and in his office, and I was responsible with him to help him to design such a mechanism that I think is an added value for Europe at the moment. First of all, let me, before I give my main message, I want to comment on your discussion, and I tend to disagree on the mistrust of science. I feel that society in general trusts more science than they trust other institutions. And data shows that they trust more the scientific world than the politicians, for example, or even the industry. And I'm from a country where we have 88% of people vaccinated, and the people queue during the night to get vaccinated. And now we have a quite well-informed young generation, but the older generation that is less educated has eager for the vaccines, and this shows a trust in science, and I think that in the pandemic this trust has increased as they see as probably the solution or the most important solution. I tend to think that the anti-vaccination sometimes is a mix of a lot of things. You can see that from countries where they very relate to their past history, countries from the old that have in the past dictatorships, like the former Eastern countries, where there is a mistrust of the organization of the state more than the science itself. So it is a very complex issue, and I wouldn't say that these movements is a movement anti-science per se. It's much more complex. There is a lot of political and political reason also in the decision of each of this person. In my country, one of the reasons is that because we not long time ago had a history of poverty, and some of us has not passed from that, but we know from our parents or our grandparents how it was with tuberculosis, with other diseases, that they were saved by vaccines at the time in a very poor condition. So we know the value of getting a vaccine. So and that is also important. So there is a lot of history and our own political history, economic history of the country. So that is determines the way you look at the acceptance of the situation nowadays. So I wouldn't put only on the trust of science. So this is my comment to your discussion. Now on the scientific advice and the need of science advice, I think that nowadays is with a very complex world, and the politicians are faced with very, very complex matters that they have to decide. And I always have the rationale that a politician needs to have a sound political advice, a sound information about the values and the ethics relate with that subject, because most of the subjects now have ethics implication. And after the administrative and political constraints like budget, political beliefs, and from these three pieces of information, a politician needs to do the decision. And these three pieces of information should be in certain way independent, and in the end, the politician should decide, taking in consideration the three, and should decide in a transparent way and communicate that. A politician, being from the government or a political group in the European Parliament or in the national parliament, should say the science tells us this, this, and this. From the ethical principles, we know this and this and this, but we have restrictions on the budget because this will cost so and so or something else. So our decision is not exactly that because of this and this and that. So it's like this that I look at, and I try to make my own decisions in my reports, in any decisions that I have to do when I was in government and now that I'm in parliament, and that I try to advise both president and commissioner when I work with them. Now, it's very important that the science advice is well done. And when I say well done, that is independent, that is transparent, and very usual. These two characteristics, we have these two characteristics. There is one that is very difficult nowadays, that is to do the synthesis of what is happening and to quantify the uncertainties. And you can see that in the present pandemic. I take, for example, the situation of my own country, that the government decided to have a group of experts, and that they regularly listen to these experts, but there is no synthesis, there is no an intermediate level that says there are these contradictions because of this and that, there are certainties here but uncertainties there. So there is not a quantification or a summary. So in certain way, this can create this can lead a bit to a mistrust in science, because the general public said, but one expert said that and the other said something else, like the vaccination of young children. And sometimes they are using the same kind of principles of science, but one is giving more weight to this and to that. So it's very important that there is a well-structured science mechanism to do this, what the famous book Honest Broker, between the science, the scientific results and the politicians. And that is missing in a lot of places. Some of in the Anglo-Saxonic tradition, they usually have that, like UK or European Commission now have that through the science advice mechanism, New Zealand, Australia, but some of the countries still do not have this structured way to do the synthesis and to quantify the uncertainties and to explain both to politicians and not only to politicians, to the society in general. Because when you are passing the message to the politicians, you are passing also the message to the society. And this is very important. Most of the governments have science advice, different models. We have done a review when we were doing the decision to have the science advice mechanism. We were doing a review of the different models. There are countries that rely a lot on the academies, other in public institutes, and others in a chief scientific advisor, and with committees, or a mix of these. And the European Commission decided to have a mixture of this. So they are relying on the academies, on the European academies, to gather all the evidence. But after there is this intermediate role of the group of chief scientific advisors that does the summary, the quantification of uncertainty based on the review that is provided by the science academies, medicine academies, and engineering academies.
Maria, can
This is very important.
Yeah. Sorry to interrupt you. We have to close very shortly, so please forgive me for interrupting. But I do want to ask you a final question, then we have to close, Maria. So we've been talking a lot about the interface between politicians and scientists and how the need to communicate more. And just a few minutes ago, Michael reminded us in the German coalition agreement that the sentence, science is not a closed system. We need to communicate more. I just wonder, as a final question, and then we wrap, given your previous position and now your current position in the European Parliament, there's a particular role for the European Parliament and people like yourself to play a role, not just in legislating and regulating and playing your part in policy making, but also in communicating science to society, as you just said, explaining science to society.
Yes, it is very important, but it's not easy to communicate science to society, and I don't know if the politicians are the best persons to communicate the science to. I think that our role is mainly to trust science and to push that the scientists also to communicate in a very clear way the science to society. I sometimes do that because of my previous career as a researcher, but for a politician that has not been a researcher, probably it's not so easy to communicate science. I think that our most important roles is to value science and to show to the society that we take science as the basis for our decision.
Right.
And as I would say 99% of the files that I deal with, they need to be based on science. It is unbelievable that, and complex, very complex phenomena. And I suppose that will continue to be like this. So we really need to have the best possible available advice, and this quantification of the uncertainties is very, very important. And it makes people to believe science if they know, if they have this clear message, and if they understand why is the difference between some disagreements, that there is a scientific reasons for these disagreements.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Maria. That's a perfect way to bring this fascinating discussion to a conclusion. My thanks to all of you and those who came before you. It's been a great an hour and a half or so. Lots to think about. I hope we can return to this in the next session of the Bayer Live Talks. In the meantime, thank you once again and have a very nice rest of the day. And thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.